Good evening and welcome to The Proof is Out There. Former intelligence official David Grush made headlines in 2023 when he claimed that the U.S. government has a secret UFO crash retrieval program. But what to do if you, as a civilian, see a UFO fall out of the sky? As you're about to see, one family had to answer that question for themselves. July 5th, 2022. James Dean and his family are fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, about 72 miles off the coast of Florida. James is recording yet another successful catch on his phone when something spectacular calls everyone's attention to the sky. A few miles away, a round object spirals toward the ocean. After 5 more objects fall in succession, James and his family decide to check it out for themselves. But as they near the site of the drop, they discover streaks of fluorescent green. When the video gets posted, commenters claim it captured a crashing UFO, and the green tint is an otherworldly result of that wreckage. If it is a crashed ET, it's allegedly not the first.
On January 8th, 2014, a large object fell into the Pacific Ocean, and the U.S. Space Command was able to confirm it did not come from this star system. Some believe that it isn't something naturally occurring, that it was actually alien in origin. And videos like this showing objects falling from the sky are actually alien craft returning home.
That's because, as journalist MJ Banias points out, some believe that the Earth's oceans are actually home to underwater alien bases.
Within the UFO narrative, there are UFOs, which are unidentified flying objects, but there's also something called a USO, which is unidentified submersible object. Some people claim that they belong to potentially some sort of extraterrestrial species, and it resides in the depths of the ocean that we have yet to explore.
This video, taken in 2015 on Russia's Lake Baikal, shows a blue-green light in the water, a light that we could not identify, and it gets weirder.
In 1982, Russian divers were operating under the water when all of a sudden they bumped into these strange creatures wearing silvery suits.
So is this video from the Gulf of Mexico further proof of water-dwelling aliens? While the idea of underwater alien bases is still speculative, underwater human bases are very real. In fact, the coast of Florida is home to an underwater research facility known as the Aquarius Reef Base. Is James's video proof of an underwater facility of the alien variety? Our experts dive in to learn more. Before we get to the object itself, we ask marine biologist Shay Steingast to address that green glow. Could it be natural?
Bioluminescence is a really common ocean adaptation, and there's at least 1,500 different species of fish that bioluminesce.
This adaptation can be used to warn predators, lure prey, or even communicate. But Steingast doesn't think that's what's happening here.
If there were animals bioluminescing or glowing here, it wouldn't be this bright, vivid green. That's not a typical color. And second off, we wouldn't be seeing this during the day. This is something entirely different than bioluminescent organisms.
So we ask aviation expert Tim McMillan, is an unidentified submerged object producing this light?
There have been reports of USOs. However, in those cases, these are transmedium objects, so objects which are able to enter the water or exit the water without any substantial change to that environment. That's not what we see here.
Notice how this bright green spreads across the water. It doesn't look as much like the roving green light of an underwater vehicle as it does a broad spill.
We obviously see this object has interacted with the environment.
If it's not nature and it's not aliens, that leaves one culprit: humans. So could this be a secret government experiment?
Typically, if you're going to test anything in secret, you wouldn't expect them to release a fluorescent dye. There's a huge indication this is by design. It's something that has been released on purpose to draw attention.
But draw attention to what? Astronomer Mark D'Antonio says there are a few possibilities.
In almost every case where there's an accident, the captain might release a fluorescein dye marker to mark their location for rescue. This is used by commercial shipping, Defense Department, in submarines, surface vessels, rocket launches, and so forth.
But McMillan thinks he can narrow it down a little further by taking a closer look at the falling object that started it all.
You'll notice that the object is leaving a corkscrew contrail. What that says is that there's been a profound change in the center of mass and center of pressure of that object. If you're looking at a multi-stage rocket, the first stage detaches itself, second stage takes over. So that first stage, where it was stable when it was all configured as one rocket, is now no longer stable, and that's where we get that spinning.
Okay, so if it's debris from a rocket launch, which one?
Now, I looked up some schedules and found that there was no SpaceX launch on July 5th, which is when this was purported to have been done. So, where does that leave us? Well, there are launches that are unknown. You won't find them listed anywhere online because they're classified launches.
Our verdict? We're pretty sure these are fallen rocket boosters intended to be recovered for reuse if that bright green dye is any indication. But we agree with Mark D'Antonio that this could be a top secret launch. The true purpose of this mission remains a mystery. Let's stay in Florida for another Sunshine State story. As we've noted before, Florida has its own variation of the Bigfoot legend. It's called the skunk ape, and just like the name suggests, it's a lot like Bigfoot, only stinkier. And while there is no conclusive evidence yet, a recent piece of video just might pass the smell test. It's January 3rd, 2015, at approximately 1 p.m. outside Tampa, Florida. Matthew McCamey and a friend are on a canoe trip in Lettuce Lake Park. They hear a noise and notice the rustling movement of tree branches nearby. Matthew grabs his phone to film the incident. The footage shows an unidentified creature, apparently covered in dark fur, slowly making its way through the water. The figure is hard to make out, but it does appear to be walking on two legs as it seemingly moves through the thick swamp with relative ease.
Let's go.
Field researcher Cliff Barrickman believes this could be actual footage of the infamous Florida skunk ape.
Skunk ape sightings have been going on for as long as people have occupied the area.
The indigenous Muskogee and Seminole tribes of the area spoke of the Estejepco, which roughly translates to furry tall man or hairy giant, who they believed protected the forest from those who mean to do it harm.
One of the best publicized reports comes from about 1957. Hunters apparently reported one of these animals coming in and raiding their food supply in their hunting camp. But that's not an isolated event. Historic newspapers very quietly told about skunk apes being in Florida and running across people.
The skunk ape is believed to have gotten its name from its foul smell, often described as similar to rotten eggs or methane gas.
It's entirely possible that this bad smell of the skunk ape has something to do with their propensity for eating meat, whether it's roadkill, carrion, dead things found rotting in the swamp, or kills that they make themselves.
The skunk ape isn't the only mysterious creature known for its foul odor. Legends of the Amazon tell of the Mapinguri, a fearsome sloth ape hybrid equipped with a toothy maw on its belly. It is rumored to emit a stench so bad it can knock you unconscious. Let's see if our experts can sniff out the truth of this foul-smelling monster. Anthropologist Kathy Strain notes a strong statistical link between Bigfoot sightings and black bear populations. In fact, on average, one Bigfoot sighting is expected for every 900 bears present in a given area. But she doesn't think that explanation fits.
What you see is clearly an upright, bipedal animal of some sort. You can hear it walking around in the water. That's not normal behavior of a bear. We do know that there are black bear in the general area, but according to the park rangers, they tend to avoid the specific location due to tourists being in the area. So I think I can safely rule out that this is a bear.
Professor of Anatomy and Anthropology Dr. Jeff Meldrum says there is a possibility that this could be an elaborate hoax, but not a strong possibility.
Who in their right mind, donning a costume, would wade into waist-deep water in a bayou that's infested by cottonmouths and alligators. That's a pretty precarious situation to put oneself in, especially encumbered with a costume.
Meldrum also notes that the animal seen in the video does appear ape-like in appearance.
There's no real obvious lack of contour. There's nothing anatomically to cause hesitation or to indicate a red flag. Obviously, it's obscured, so we can't say anything about limb proportions.
But Strain says not so fast. She smells something rotten about the Lettuce Lake footage. According to her research, the eyewitness here conspired with his buddies to create a handful of skunk ape hoaxes back in early 2015.
While researching this video, I discovered that the persons involved in this are well-known hoaxers. They did 2 other hoaxes in the general area, including a 2-headed alligator and a Photoshop photograph of a Bigfoot in the swamp. What I believe we are seeing is a person in a suit. I just can't believe that after doing 2 hoaxes that they would get lucky and actually get a real skunk ape on tape.
Our verdict? This is most likely a hoax. But Dr. Meldrum brings up an interesting point. If it is a hoax, wading through those dangerous waters makes it a risky one. And remember, the skunk ape has allegedly been spotted and smelled all across the Southeast. If you have the proof, please send it our way. It is well known that there are people who believe we never landed on the moon and that all those iconic NASA images were faked on a Hollywood soundstage. But did you know some believe something similar is going on with missions to Mars? Is NASA pulling off the biggest con job in space history? It's February 2021 on Mars. NASA's Perseverance rover successfully lands to begin its mission on the surface of our neighboring planet. But a few of the photos from this mission and earlier ones have left some people scratching their heads. On the surface, they appear to show stones scattered on the lifeless red planet. But if you look a little bit closer, some say these objects may not be stones at all. One of the images contains what looks like a walrus femur bone. Another seems to have the remains of a whale vertebrae. And if you zoom in very close, on the third one, there's what appears to be a live rodent. So, some people are calling this a lemming. Okay, let's get a better look. Here's what they say are its eyes, its nose, and its short, stubby legs. Writer and producer Billy Carson says these aren't the first odd things he's seen while studying Mars.
About 8 years ago, I started getting real deep into searching for space anomalies, predominantly on Mars because Mars has the most. And a lot of those images have things that appear to be out of place. They don't belong with the surrounding terrain.
Billy says some believe that's because these images are not even really from Mars. They're from a remote spot in northern Canada called Devon Island.
Devon Island became a research facility to test out rovers in 1996, roughly. The reason why they chose Devon Island is because of its Mars-like conditions, the cold temperature of the rocks, the terrain, and everything else.
Author Jason Martell says, according to the theory proposed by so-called Mars truthers, after the rovers were tested on Devon Island, they never made it to Mars because NASA didn't have the technological prowess.
Mars truthers have said that if you go onto NASA's website, a lot of the photos might be fakes, and that the actual stored location of these rovers are now deep within a hangar at NASA and not on the surface of Mars.
So are these actually photos of real animals and animal remains here on Earth?
We can see that the first one does have a strong resemblance to a lemming, a walrus femur bone. Even the third photo that shows questionably some type of a whale vertebrae, those are all native to Devon Island.
Since the mid-1970s, NASA has launched 10 missions with landers or rovers to the surface of Mars, with most categorized as successful or operational. Could they really all have been just a series of elaborate hoaxes? Let's let our experts bring this one back down to Earth. Astrophotographer Andrew McCarthy says there's solid evidence. We first started sending probes to Mars decades ago.
Viking will begin a new search. Now, if we wanted to prove that NASA's actually been to Mars, we could look at one of our rivals. China actually has an orbiter named Tianwen-1 that's actually photographed the rovers on the Martian surface.
And McCarthy adds that you don't even need to be a scientist in order to track the Mars rovers.
Any amateur with a radio telescope can actually detect the signals from these probes that are in Martian orbit. While the amateur astronomers may not be able to decipher exactly what they're picking up, the Deep Space Network collects the signal from the probes, which is then interpreted by NASA and publicly available to all.
But if these images are actually from the rovers, how is it that they appear to show evidence of life on Mars? NASA geologist Dr. Bob Anderson checks out the photo that's said to be of a whale vertebrae.
The wind, although very weak on Mars, has a tendency to carve up these very soft rocks, making these beautiful sculptures that we find. Like in national parks where you have arches, what you're seeing is the predominant wind coming from the left to the right that's carving into these grooves, which making it look like it's a vertebrae.
Video analyst Mick West believes there's a similar misidentification going on with the so-called walrus bone.
Femurs do not have shapes that kind of stick out in that way. I think all that we're looking at here is just some rocks that are partially buried. If you look through thousands of photographs of rocks, you're going to find some that resemble other things.
But what about this apparent live limbing? West now takes a closer look.
If you take this image and you kind of adjust the contrast, it looks exactly the same as a lot of the other rocks. The only thing that really makes this look kind of rodenty is that there's a couple of pixels that are kind of dark. So if we remove these pixels by placing it with something else in the scene, then it immediately becomes a lot less like a rodent. This is a natural human thing. If we see anything that looks vaguely face-like, we start interpreting that as being an actual face.
As any regular viewer of this program will know, this phenomenon is known as pareidolia. And that's our verdict. This is a case of pareidolia. Though the images sure do resemble remains from Devon Island's fauna, we can confirm that NASA's Mars images are indeed coming from Mars, at least until the Mars truthers send us some more convincing evidence. With its warm waters and stunning coral reefs, Mexico continues to be a destination for all serious scuba divers. And while encountering new and unique forms of life is supposed to be part of the scuba experience, could it be a new way to spot alien life forms as well? It's July 17th, 2022. Scuba enthusiast and Instagrammer Pedro Valencia is diving in Cozumel, Mexico, when he comes across something highly unusual. His camera captures a transparent creature drifting through the waters with an eerie, luminescent glow, and a lifeless fish seems to be stuck in its neon appendages. Field researcher Ken Gerhardt agrees that this is no run-of-the-mill jellyfish equipped with a laser light show.
It's not a jellyfish that I'm familiar with, but it almost has a weird alien-like appearance.
Did he say alien? As we mentioned earlier, some ufologists believe sophisticated extraterrestrials are operating out of underwater bases. But there's another theory that alien life actually arrived here in a microscopic form.
So in recent years, there's been a hypothesis known as the panspermia theory. What this suggests is that life on Earth was seeded by matter from other planets, other solar systems that traveled to Earth perhaps hundreds of millions of years ago.
In 2018, a research paper created by a team of 33 scientists was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, claiming that one ocean dweller we all know is a creation of these space seeds. The investigating team believed that many of the extraordinary traits of the octopus were borrowed not from some earthly ancestor, but from somewhere else in the cosmos.
It has incredible intelligence. It has the ability to morph or change its body structure, its color and texture, and perhaps most impressively, the octopus has the ability to spontaneously alter its genetic code. So these seem like supernatural abilities.
Likewise, could specimens like this one in our video be proof of further aquatic extraterrestrials? Several researchers say the reason octopi and other cephalopods look so different from other earthly creatures is that this otherworldly genetic mutation may have caused them to look like whatever alien species they allegedly spawned from. Translation, some aliens could look like that. Let's see what our experts have to say about this underwater enigma. Biology professor Floyd Hayes says the panspermia theory doesn't present enough evidence to contradict the octopus's origin on Earth's evolutionary chain.
Octopuses go way back in the fossil record. They are closely related to squids and other groups of cephalopods. They have evolved very little in the last millions of years.
So is it possible that this specimen is of alien origin? Marine biologist Shay Steingass is doubtful.
I don't think we have to look to foreign planets to figure out what this creature is. Theories like panspermia aren't generally scientifically accepted because we don't have a lot of direct evidence for this actually happening. Imagine a microorganism traveling for millions of light years through space in extremely cold temperatures with no nutrients, no oxygen, no atmosphere to protect them from direct UV radiation in a vacuum, landing on a planet that they're not even evolved to thrive in. And that's not to say it couldn't happen, but it doesn't make a lot of biological sense.
And as for that strange, unique glow?
Bioluminescence is a chemical reaction that happens when the bacteria within the tissues of the organism undergo an excitatory response, and that movement of electrons is triggered and a flash of light is produced, which can attract food items to it. So this fish may have been attracted by these little flashes of light.
With all our space alien theories deep sixth, could we just be looking at an ordinary jellyfish after all? Steingass says, not exactly.
What we're looking at isn't a single animal. It's actually a colony of animals that have formed together to create one organism. It's called a hydrozoan.
Hydrozoans, like the Portuguese man of war, are a multifunctional unit where all the parts benefit from the whole. And discovering one with bioluminescent qualities outside of the deep ocean is quite a rarity.
Thousands of these little animals band together to form essentially one cohesive organism. So it is really kind of something out of science fiction.
Our verdict, hydrozoan. This is, in fact, not one animal, but a group of creatures made up of a cnidarian jelly and bioluminescent bacteria. The debate about whether the octopus evolved from an interstellar ancestor is still ongoing. So we'll keep an eye on the oceans for any potential signs of extraterrestrial life. You know what they say? What happens in Vegas, yeah, stays in Vegas. But what about what happens above Vegas? 'Twas 2 nights before Christmas 2022, and all through the Las Vegas Strip, every creature was stirring. But the party atmosphere is broken when club manager Brett Feinstein spots a commotion outside his gentleman's club.
I was walking through the club, and one of our security guards told me that there was a UFO above the club.
As the club empties into the street to see the spectacle, Brett hits record on his smartphone.
I pointed the camera up into the sky. There was a big red light, 2 long white lights, and then on each end of this thing were white lights, and the consensus was, this is a UFO.
Oh my God. Author Jason Martell points out that with the Vegas city limits only a hop from the legendary Area 51 and other remote military bases, many wonder what kind of strange aircraft populate the Vegas airspace.
We know that more than a dozen miles from Area 51 inside the Yucca Flats lays Area 6. It's a lone landing strip. It has a handful of hangars. It's still classified by the Department of Defense and Homeland Security. It's very possible that what we're seeing in this footage is some type of a night test of drones or some type of an advanced aircraft.
But in an age where billionaires have their own rocket ships, it's not just the military launching experimental aircraft.
We know that Kimball Musk, the brother of Elon, had started his own drone company called Nova Sky Stories. based out of Nevada. In August of 2022, they had launched a series of blue light drones over Vegas. When the local community saw these lights in the sky, they quickly thought that this was some type of UFO activity.
It takes 12 million lights to illuminate the Las Vegas Strip, making it the brightest city on Earth when viewed from space. Could these lights serve as a beacon to ET visitors? Or are they playing tricks on the eyes of the city's hard-partying humans? I'd put pretty good odds on the experts getting to the bottom of this one. Given the already crowded skies above Las Vegas, meteorologist Juan Hernandez thinks it's unlikely to be an alien spaceship or experimental aircraft.
Given that the Las Vegas airport is quite active, we would have heard from air traffic control if there was something that was hovering atop of the Las Vegas Strip.
Science writer Mick West considers whether this could be a different kind of flying machine, like a drone.
If it was a military drone, it would be moving. Military drones generally don't hover. If it was a smaller drone, you would see the individual points of light. Here we see things that look like big objects. You could theoretically get a cluster of drones very, very close together, like 20,000 feet up, but that's something that's technically extraordinarily difficult to pull off, and it doesn't seem very likely in this case.
Hernandez thinks the real clue may lie in those clouds and the Christmas weather.
It was a chilly night in Las Vegas. It was 39 degrees. The clouds were at about 15,000 feet, which is important because at 15,000 feet, it was just cold enough for these clouds to have some ice particles, which would then promote the development of light pillars.
Light pillars, you say? Well, yes.
We have ice crystals that are suspended in the air that are acting as tiny mirrors, each tiny mirror reflecting a beam of light towards the viewer. Oftentimes, people think they're UFOs. In reality, it's an optical illusion.
According to West, to figure out the source of those reflections, you first need a map of the Strip.
Someone noticed that this light here and this light here look kind of similar to two hotels, the Wynn Hotel and the Encore Hotel. And the red one here is the Hilton Hotel. And we can kind of demonstrate this by taking this particular image and overlaying it on top of a map of Las Vegas. Here are the hotels, the Wynn and the Encore, and over here we have the Hilton. And if we take the photo that we were just looking at and we overlay it, we kind of see that they're in the same position. This is a light pillar map. It's a reflection of the lights on the Las Vegas Strip on the ice crystals in the clouds.
Our verdict, light pillars. The odds of witnessing them are longer than hitting blackjack. So that Vegas Christmas crowd should still feel pretty lucky. The surface of a mirror is supposed to reflect the light that hits it. Yet, could it be possible for a mirror to not only reflect images from this world, but to project them from another one? Take a look. It's July 2020 in Portland, Oregon. Local resident Danny Tumia and his 2-year-old son are walking down the hallway of their old apartment building, which was converted from a hotel in the 1980s. Danny records with his phone as his son approaches a mirror and begins to wave and point into it. It's as if he's catching a glimpse of an old friend. Then, while he's turning away, a ghostly face suddenly appears at the edge of the mirror. At first, it seems like it could be the condensation from the boy's breath. But here, take a closer look. There's no mistaking what appear to be two hollow, gaping eyes.
It almost makes you like stop dead in your tracks, and you freeze up because you're like, what is this? What am I looking at?
And Danny says this wasn't the first time his son exhibited a strange affinity for the mirror.
My son would just always go right to it. It was like he was talking to something or somebody. It gives me the heebie-jeebies just thinking about it.
According to author Alexis Brooks, many cultures associate mirrors with the supernatural.
For centuries, both the ancient Maya as well as Aztecs believed that mirrors served as portals to another world and could actually be used as tools for divination.
These stories of the otherworldly power of mirrors have persisted throughout the centuries, inspiring wonder and morbid fear.
Now, the Victorians, what they would do with mirrors in the home of the deceased is they would cover all of them with cloth, because they believe that the newly dead might get confused and get caught up in the mirror and not go where they were intended to go.
Anthropologists have long speculated that when early humans saw their reflections, they thought they were looking at a likeness that could take on a life of its own. In some ways, this suggests that we have always had this sense of a mirror universe. So could we finally be seeing proof of this other world? Our experts see through a glass darkly. First, theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku considers if we could be witnessing a mirror universe in this video.
Physicists actually look at the mathematics of parallel universes on the other side of the looking glass. And even the great cosmologist Stephen Hawking wrote papers about whether or not these mirror universes could exist. But the energy necessary to open these gateways is comparable to that of a black hole.
Since there's no black hole in Danny's apartment building, we consider if there might be a ghost in the mirror. Well, we did some digging and couldn't find anything about any young children dying tragically here when this was a hotel. But video analyst Mick West has another theory about the image of this alleged ghost child.
You can see here the eyes match, the nose matches, the hairline matches. So it's the same child. It kind of leads us with really only two possible explanations. Either it's a real ghost or it's a fake video. And I'm going to go with fake video.
Why so sure? Mostly because this type of video manipulation is pretty easy to pull off.
All you would have to do is take a copy of the baby's face, post it in that position, and then just move it around as the mirror moved. I took a copy of the baby's head and I pasted it down in that location. And I reduced the opacity down to about 20-odd%, so it gives it that ghostly quality. Then I use what's called keyframing. I set up a position track here and moved the baby's head so that it matched the frame of the mirror. And so we end up with this very similar effect. There's a little ghostly after image.
Our verdict? Hoax. After a little snooping, we discovered that Danny has posted other allegedly unexplained run-ins with the unknown. Although he has never admitted to doctoring his videos, we're pretty sure our reflections on this one are accurate. Hollywood can produce some impressive sound effects. But what happens when a real-life massive sound straight out of an explosive blockbuster echoes throughout Los Angeles? Just look and listen. January 23rd, 2021, Los Angeles, California. It's a chilly, rainy day when warehouse worker Eric Reyes is startled by a strange sound coming from the sky. He grabs his cell phone and records this. The typical sounds of rainfall are echoed by a distant, otherworldly hum. The sound is constant and reverberates throughout the whole community.
At first, I was in denial, and I was like, I don't want to hear this sound. But it kept on going, so I went outside my patio. I started filming the sound. I was scared a little bit. That really freaked me out. I did some research. Some people would say something hiding behind the clouds.
And what's truly odd is that similar sounds were reported in other parts of Southern California around that time. Author Jason Martell explores the theory that sounds like these, as well as many others heard around the world, could be entering our atmosphere from space.
One of the possible theories of what we're hearing is plasma wave. Plasma is the fourth state of matter, very similar to gas, but all the particles are ionized. Occasionally, the sun emits coronal mass ejections, which are large explosions of plasma from the magnetic field of the sun's corona.
According to NASA, these coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, can create currents in Earth's magnetic fields, altering frequencies that can be heard as a strange cacophony of noise. Martell points out that just like the horns of Armageddon from the Book of Revelation, these sounds could also spell the end of the world as we know it. Could our ancient prophecies be referencing this scientific phenomenon?
Most powerful CMEs can damage our electrical grids, satellites, or even our internet. A massive CME could be a near-apocalyptic event.
And while this theory has become increasingly popular, others think that these sounds could be part of a pattern specific to Southern California.
Many have theorized that these could also be related to the San Diego booms. They were recorded in March, June, and December of 2021, the same year as the Los Angeles sounds.
Those mysterious San Diego booms were never explained, and while San Diego is right next to a naval base on nearby Coronado Island, officials for the base denied any involvement. However, some still speculate that it could be part of an experimental program involving sonic weapons, weapons like the LRAD, or Low-Range Acoustic Device, which is being used around the world for crowd control and dispersal.
Many have said that the Navy has acquired armed merchant ships and have outfitted them with modular weapons systems. Is it possible that the sounds we're hearing are coming from these new naval capabilities right off the coast of Los Angeles?
If the Navy were secretly arming merchant ships, LA seems like a pretty good place to do it. The port of LA is the busiest in the Western Hemisphere and moves nearly $300 billion worth of cargo every year. But are some of these ships being secretly retrofitted for the future of naval warfare? We turn it to our experts to investigate. Meteorologist Juan Hernandez examines whether the conditions in this footage were a perfect storm for coronal mass ejections.
The federal government constantly monitors coronal mass ejections and their impact across the world. Taking a look at the planetary K index, which measures overall electromagnetic waves out in space, we see that this was not related to a solar storm or electromagnetic waves.
With the outer space theory neutralized, we turn to forensic audio analyst Rob Maher to see if these sounds are even real in the first place.
In this recording, there was no indication that it had been assembled or layered or put together from other sources. It appears to be authentic.
So if the recording is real, could it be some form of sonic weapon being tested? Maher is doubtful. He says sonic weapons such as the LRAD are highly directional. They would most likely not reverberate inconsistently like we hear here.
So it does not seem like that this sounds in this recording would be attributable to military operations.
If these sounds aren't being produced by the military, then what are we hearing?
The area in which the recording was made does have some industrial operations, so I compared the recording to some sounds of manufacturing equipment. So this manufacturing system has tonal qualities, so frequencies that we can observe in the spectrogram. It also has a repetitive sound, but the overall effect is similar to what we heard in the example recording. So it is conceivable that the sound might be from some sort of industrial source.
Of course, these two sounds are not identical, but again, it's the tonal qualities in the spectrogram that Maher's focusing on.
Some of the other characteristics are a little bit different, and so it's hard to attribute it exactly to a particular manufacturing process. But it's certainly plausible that that could be from an industrial source.
The first report arrived without ceremony. Buried among dozens of amateur videos and breathless emails sent to the production desk of The Proof is out there. Yet there was something in the way the witness described the sound before the image appear that made the entire room fall quiet. A low dragging splash followed by what he called a wet inhale, as if the swamp itself had taken a breath. And when the footage finally played on the large monitor, the image was predictably unstable. Night. Vision green smeared with rain and trembling hands. But within the distortion emerged a silhouette rising from the cypress water. Tall, hunched, its shoulders crowned with what looked like matted vegetation, moving not with the clumsy panic of a bear or the cautious step of a heron, but with a deliberate, almost weary intent. And the narrator's voice cracked as he whispered that he had hunted these marshes since childhood, and never once felt hunted until that night. The segment producers argued, quietly at first, debating hoax probabilities and costume feasibility. Yet the host, a veteran investigator whose calm skepticism had become the show's spine, leaned forward, eyes narrowed, because the creature's gait did not match any known animal locomotion database they kept, and more troubling still was the timestamp glitch embedded in the file, a 5-second anomaly that suggested either editing sophistication beyond the witness's means or an interference pattern they had only ever seen once before, in a case involving unexplained aerial footage over New Mexico. While the team prepared to dismiss or debunk, a second file arrived from a completely different source. This one a trail camera image captured 3 nights earlier, less dramatic but more disturbing in its stillness, showing deep impressions in the mud, not matching human boots or known fauna, elongated with a trilobe pressure pattern, as if whatever had stepped there distributed its weight wrong for Earth gravity. And it was at this moment that the narrative of the episode, and eventually the investigation, shifted from curiosity to unease, because cross-referencing metadata revealed both files shared the same electromagnetic noise signature, an erratic spike pattern previously cataloged under what the internal database labeled Martian C-class anomalies, a term borrowed half-jokingly from an early NASA telemetry classification for unexplained signal clusters during the Viking missions. The host began, outlining the plan for a field investigation, not because he believed in swamp monsters or extraterrestrial remnants, but because the data itself was misbehaving and data, unlike legends, did not lie without leaving fingerprints. So within days a small crew found themselves knee-deep in the Louisiana wetlands, the air thick with insects and rot, guided by the original witness, a soft-spoken man whose fear had not faded with daylight. And as they moved deeper into the swamp, the equipment began to misfire in subtle ways, audio channels dropping for seconds at a time, compasses rotating slowly without settling, and a persistent low-frequency hum registering just below human hearing, enough to cause nausea and a pressure behind the eyes. The witness stopped near a cluster of cypress knees and pointed to a patch of disturbed water, explaining that this was where the thing had stood watching him load his boat. And when the host asked the most important question, the one he always asked, "What made you certain it was not an animal?" the man answered without hesitation that animals run or hide when confronted. But this thing had waited, and waiting implied intent. As night fell, the swamp transformed, shadows stretching unnaturally long under infrared lamps, and it was then that a third anomaly emerged, not visual but thermal, a cold void moving slowly against the ambient warmth of the water, shaped vaguely like a man, but registering several degrees below the surrounding environment, an inversion that defied basic biological logic, prompting the crew to fall silent as the host narrated carefully, reminding viewers that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof, yet acknowledging that what they were observing did not fit into any comfortable category. The moment passed without dramatic reveal, the cold shape dissolving into noise, but its absence felt heavier than its presence, and back at base camp the team reviewed footage frame by frame, discovering micro flickers within the thermal void that resembled structured geometry rather than organic movement, repeating angles that echoed patterns found in crop formation analyses, and, disturbingly, in declassified Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter surface scans, a connection that no one in the room wanted to voice aloud, but which hung between them like humidity. The host finally broke the silence by stating that if this were a hoax, it was the most layered and data-consistent one they had ever encountered, involving knowledge and resources far beyond local pranksters. And if it were an animal, it represented a biological anomaly of unprecedented scale, leaving only a third option that the show had always treated with caution, that some phenomena existed in the margins between categories, not alien in the cinematic sense, but not entirely terrestrial either. As dawn approached, a final discovery was made when the sound engineer isolated the low-frequency hum recorded throughout the night, slowing it down and filtering it until it resolved into a pattern uncannily similar to a signal burst recorded by NASA in 1976 during a brief communication blackout with the Viking 2 lander, labeled at the time as Martian C. anomaly and dismissed as cosmic interference. Yet here it was again, whispering through a Louisiana swamp nearly 50 years later. And as the episode's preliminary conclusion took shape, the host recorded his closing remarks with unusual restraint, emphasizing that while no definitive proof of a swamp beast or Martian remnant could be declared, the convergence of independent data streams demanded further investigation, because the most unsettling possibility was not that monsters or visitors existed, but that the boundaries we assumed between myth, science, and history were thinner than we were comfortable admitting, and that something had learned to move quietly between them, watching, waiting, and leaving behind just enough evidence to make denial feel dishonest. By the time the footage from the swamp aired, public reaction followed the familiar arc of fascination, ridicule, and polarized belief. Yet behind the scenes, the investigative team found themselves unable to let go of the case, not because of online speculation, but because new information continued to surface without solicitation, as if the anomaly itself had learned the language of attention and was feeding it carefully. And within 48 hours of broadcast, emails arrived from disparate corners of the country describing eerily similar experiences. A fisherman in Florida who reported a towering shape standing motionless in brackish water while his depth finder spiked erratically. A hunter in Arkansas whose game camera captured a thermal absence instead of a heat signature. And most unsettling of all, a retired radio engineer from Nevada who recognized the low-frequency hum isolated by the sound engineer as a harmonic echo of a signal he had once intercepted during classified work in the late 1970s, a signal that, according to him, had been quietly flagged and buried because it did not behave like noise but like intent. The host convened a closed-door meeting, something rarely done for a single unresolved case, and laid out the growing pattern with clinical precision, noting that each report shared three constants: proximity to wetlands or mineral-rich soil, temporary electromagnetic instability, and a sensation witnesses struggled to describe except as being observed by something patient and old. And as the researchers mapped these reports geographically, a rough arc emerged stretching from the Gulf Coast up through the Mississippi Basin and curving westward toward the deserts of the American Southwest, eerily mirroring ancient trade and migration routes, a coincidence too poetic to ignore yet too precise to dismiss. Attention then shifted to the Martian sea designation itself, a term that had lived half-forgotten in declassified appendices, and a junior researcher, driven by curiosity more than assignment, dug through archived NASA documents, uncovering a series of internal memos discussing anomalous telemetry packets received during the Viking missions that exhibited non-random repetition and adaptive compression, characteristics inconsistent with cosmic radiation or hardware malfunction. And although officially explained away, handwritten notes in the margins hinted at discomfort among engineers who felt the signals behaved less like interference and more like response. The implication was not that something had come from Mars, but that something had been learned there, something about communication across vast environmental boundaries. And as this context seeped into the swamp case, the host began to frame the investigation differently, no longer asking what the creature was, but what function it served. Returning to Louisiana for a second field operation, the team brought upgraded equipment and an expanded crew, including a biologist specializing in extremophiles and a physicist familiar with nonlinear signal propagation. And from the first night, it was clear the environment reacted differently to their presence. Insects falling silent in concentric patterns, water surfaces flattening unnaturally as if dampened by pressure, and the same low-frequency hum returning with greater clarity, causing mild disorientation among the crew. One cameraman describing the sensation as standing too close to a massive engine, idling beneath the earth. When the thermal anomaly appeared again, it lingered longer this time, its outline sharper, revealing limb proportions subtly off, knees bending too low, shoulders too broad. And the biologist whispered that no vertebrate should move like that without structural collapse, while the physicist noted faint geometric oscillations within the void, shapes forming and dissolving in sequences reminiscent of error-correcting codes. An attempt was made to communicate, not verbally but technologically, broadcasting a low-power signal modulated with the same harmonic structure as the recorded hum, a decision debated fiercely beforehand, yet justified on the grounds that observation alone had yielded diminishing returns, and for several 10 seconds nothing happened, until the swamp water nearest the signal source began to vibrate gently, ripples forming perfect concentric circles, and the thermal void shifted closer, not aggressively but inquisitively, prompting the host to narrate with measured calm that what they were witnessing suggested not predation or territorial behavior, but recognition. Abruptly, all equipment shut down simultaneously, plunging the crew into darkness broken only by starlight. And in that silence a sound emerged unaided, not a roar or growl but a layered resonance, multiple tones overlapping, vibrating through bone rather than ear, leaving several crew members visibly shaken afterward, unable to articulate what they felt except to say it seemed to carry information without words. When systems rebooted minutes later, the anomaly was gone, leaving behind only disturbed water and an inexplicable residue on nearby vegetation, later analyzed to contain unusual isotopic ratios consistent with materials found in certain meteorites, a discovery that reignited debate about extraterrestrial origins, while simultaneously undermining simplistic invasion narratives, because nothing about the encounter suggested hostility or conquest. Back in the studio, as the episode edit took shape, ethical questions surfaced, particularly whether continued investigation risked provoking something poorly understood. Yet the host argued that ignorance carried its own danger, especially if the phenomenon had been interacting with human environments for decades unnoticed. And as he reviewed the newly arrived testimony from the radio engineer, corroborated by archived signal logs, a disturbing hypothesis formed that the Martian Sea anomalies were not messages sent outward, but calibration signals, probes testing the permeability of environments, learning how information and matter behaved under different planetary conditions. This reframed the swamp sightings not as isolated curiosities, but as checkpoints, places where the boundary between systems thinned enough to allow observation, and perhaps limited interaction, and when a final revelation emerged from the Nevada engineer, who admitted that his work had involved monitoring subterranean communication experiments using mineral-rich rock as transmission medium, experiments abruptly canceled after unexplained feedback patterns caused equipment failures and severe headaches among staff. The narrative tightened further, suggesting that whatever intelligence lay behind the signals favored liminal spaces, swamps, deserts, fault lines, places where Earth itself was in flux. The host concluded the second part of the investigation by acknowledging that while no definitive entity could yet be named, the accumulating evidence pointed toward a phenomenon adaptive, restrained, and deeply patient, one that did not announce itself but responded selectively. And as he looked into the camera, his tone uncharacteristically grave, he reminded viewers that the most unsettling discoveries were rarely those that arrived loudly from the sky, but those that had been quietly sharing our margins, learning us as carefully as we learned them, waiting for the moment when proof was no longer avoidable, but understanding remained elusive. The shift from private investigation to institutional attention happened quietly, without press releases or dramatic confrontations, marked instead by sudden tightening of access, delayed responses to routine information requests, and a noticeable change in tone when the production team attempted to consult external experts, because within days of the second episode's internal review cut, circulating among network executives, representatives from multiple federal agencies requested copies of the raw data under the pretext of national security relevance, a phrase so broad it effectively ended negotiation, and while cooperation was framed as voluntary, the message beneath was unmistakable. This phenomenon had crossed an invisible threshold. The host, accustomed to skepticism but not obstruction, documented every interaction meticulously, noting how inquiries about the Martian Sea classification were met with polite deflection. Yet when the isotopic residue from the swamp vegetation was mentioned, conversations ended abruptly. suggesting a sensitivity that had nothing to do with folklore and everything to do with precedent. Through informal channels, a retired geophysicist contacted the team, explaining that similar residues had been logged decades earlier near experimental transmission sites using deep earth mineral lattices to test low-frequency communication resilience. Experiments abandoned after anomalous feedback caused unexplained cognitive effects in test subjects, including time distortion, intrusive imagery, and a persistent sense of being accompanied, symptoms once dismissed as psychosomatic, but now chillingly consistent with witness testimony from the swamp. Despite mounting pressure, the team proceeded with a third field operation, this time not to provoke or communicate, but to observe patterns over extended duration, deploying passive sensors across a wider area. And it was during this phase that behavior changes became undeniable, as the anomaly, whatever its nature, began appearing farther from traditional liminal environments, briefly registering near a flood control station and later near a decommissioned phosphate plant, both sites rich in conductive minerals, suggesting adaptation or perhaps necessity. The physicists proposed that earlier interactions, particularly the broadcast signal attempt, may have altered the phenomenon's risk assessment, not as hostility, but as awareness of being studied, an idea reinforced when sensor logs revealed deliberate avoidance of certain frequencies after they were introduced, behavior implying learning. Public reaction intensified as rumors leaked online, framed alternately as government cover-up, cryptic confirmation, or viral marketing stunt. Yet what unsettled the host most was a confidential briefing he received under strict non-disclosure, in which an unnamed official acknowledged the existence of legacy programs monitoring what were termed persistent non-anthropogenic intelligences, entities or systems not originating from human design, yet not conclusively extraterrestrial, tracked primarily through signal anomalies and environmental effects rather than physical form. And although the official refused to confirm any link to the swamp case, his insistence that engagement protocols exist for a reason suggested prior mistakes. The consequences of those mistakes surfaced when a coastal monitoring buoy unexpectedly transmitted a burst matching the Martian sea. Harmonic structure, triggering an automated response system designed decades earlier and long forgotten, resulting in a focused energy emission into the surrounding water, an action intended originally as a calibration ping but now, in hindsight, dangerously presumptive, because within hours multiple anomalies were reported across 3 states, including mass fish die-offs, localized fog formation exhibiting unusual density gradients, and a surge of low-frequency auditory complaints among residents, all pointing to a systemic reaction rather than coincidence. Reviewing the data, the host articulated a sobering hypothesis that the phenomenon was not singular but distributed, less a creature than a process capable of manifesting localized interfaces when environmental conditions aligned. Interfaces perceived by humans as figures or beasts because the mind struggled to render something operating at a different informational scale. This reframing cast earlier sightings in a new light, not as migrations but as activations, moments when the system surfaced briefly to assess, adjust, or respond. The moral weight of continued investigation grew heavier when leaked audio surfaced of a closed-door meeting in which officials debated escalation, including aggressive signal testing designed to force consistent manifestation, a strategy the physicists vehemently opposed, arguing that any system demonstrating adaptive restraint likely did so for a reason, and that provocation risked destabilizing interactions refined over decades. Despite objections, a limited test proceeded in a controlled desert environment, chosen for isolation and geological conductivity. And though the production team was excluded, secondary data reached them through sympathetic sources, revealing that the test achieved its objective only briefly, producing a massive thermal void visible from multiple platforms before collapsing into chaotic interference, followed by widespread equipment failure and a spike in neurological symptoms among nearby personnel. Shortly after, the swamp anomaly returned, but altered, appearing closer to populated areas and persisting longer, its movements less passive, its presence harder to ignore, as if something once content to observe had been forced to renegotiate its boundaries. In a rare moment of personal reflection captured on camera, the host admitted uncertainty, not just about the phenomenon, but about humanity's reflexive need to categorize and control, noting that every escalation thus far traced back to fear of ambiguity rather than evidence of threat. And as he spoke, new footage arrived from a suburban drainage canal showing a familiar cold silhouette standing beneath streetlights, unnoticed by passing cars yet unmistakably present, a quiet indictment of assumptions that such things belonged only in remote wilderness. The episode's third act concluded not with answers, but with accountability, the host addressing viewers directly to clarify that proof was not merely a matter of visual confirmation, but of recognizing patterns, consequences, and responsibility, because the most dangerous myth was not that monsters lurked in swamps, but that intelligence unlike our own would announce itself on our terms. And as the final frame froze on the canal footage, the implication was clear and unsettling that the phenomenon had not changed its nature, only its proximity, and that whatever came next would be shaped, less by what it was, and more by how humanity chose to respond. What no one anticipated, least of all the production team, was how quickly the phenomenon would begin to exert pressure not just on systems and institutions, but on the people closest to it, because in the weeks following the canal sighting, subtle psychological effects emerged among witnesses, researchers, and even casual viewers who reported an inexplicable sense of familiarity when watching the footage, a feeling not of fear but of recognition, as though something in the images resonated with buried memory rather than imagination. The host himself became aware of a shift during routine narration sessions, when certain phrases triggered brief lapses in concentration, moments where the studio lights seemed dimmer and the hum of electronics louder. And though he dismissed these at first as fatigue, patterns emerged when multiple crew members independently described similar sensations, including vivid dreams involving waterlogged landscapes, mineral caverns, and a presence that communicated not through speech but through spatial awareness, conveying intent by proximity rather than command. Consulting a cognitive neuroscientist under condition of anonymity, the team learned that low-frequency exposure combined with ambiguous stimuli could, in rare cases, synchronize neural patterning across individuals, a phenomenon usually observed only in tightly controlled laboratory environments, yet here it appeared spontaneously, correlated directly with exposure to the anomalies. Signal profile. This revelation reframed the phenomenon's influence as participatory rather than invasive, raising the unsettling possibility that understanding it required a degree of mental alignment, not coercion. Meanwhile, governmental response grew increasingly fragmented, with competing agencies issuing contradictory directives, some advocating containment and suppression, others urging transparency to prevent uncontrolled public speculation, and still others quietly reviving dormant research initiatives predicated on the assumption that the phenomenon could be leveraged, an assumption that alarmed those who recognized echoes of past technological hubris. Leaked documents revealed that similar phenomena had been observed intermittently throughout the 20th century, often near major infrastructure projects involving dams, mines, and deep drilling, yet each incident had been siloed, explained away, or buried under unrelated priorities, resulting in a fractured historical record that obscured continuity. As the production team pieced together this mosaic, a troubling narrative emerged, one suggesting that the phenomenon's increased visibility was not an invasion, but a response to cumulative environmental alteration, human activity, reshaping geological and electromagnetic landscapes faster than existing systems could adapt, forcing whatever intelligence operated within those margins to surface more frequently, if only to recalibrate. This hypothesis gained traction when satellite data revealed subtle shifts in ionospheric behavior above recent sighting clusters, shifts too small to disrupt communications, but consistent enough to indicate feedback between surface activity and upper atmospheric layers. The host addressed these findings with measured restraint, emphasizing correlation rather than causation. Yet privately, he wrestled with the ethical implications of continued exposure, particularly as anonymous reports arrived from viewers describing compulsive rewatching of segments, accompanied by mild headaches and an urge to seek out wetlands or open water, behaviors that bordered uncomfortably on influence. Pressure mounted when network executives questioned whether the show itself had become a vector, amplifying not just awareness but interaction. And for the first time since its inception, the proof is out there faced the possibility that investigation might itself be intervention. The turning point came with the testimony of a former emergency management coordinator who described an incident during a flood response years earlier, when rescue teams reported a towering figure standing calmly amid rising waters, directing currents subtly away from residential zones, an account dismissed at the time as stress-induced hallucination, yet supported by anomalous flow data indicating inexplicable redirection. Revisiting these archives with fresh context, the team recognized a pattern of quiet mitigation rather than threat, moments where the phenomenon's presence coincided with reduced damage or stabilized conditions, suggesting a role less adversarial and more custodial, a possibility that unsettled assumptions far more than the idea of a hostile unknown. Debates intensified within the team about framing, language, and responsibility, particularly whether continuing to label the manifestation as a beast reinforced fear-based narratives incompatible with emerging evidence. Yet changing terminology risked backlash from audiences invested in spectacle. The host ultimately chose nuance over comfort, dedicating a segment to examining humanity's historical tendency to mythologize misunderstood forces, from storms personified as gods to diseases framed as moral judgment, arguing that such narratives often obscured functional understanding and delayed meaningful adaptation. As if in response, new data arrived showing the anomaly altering its manifestation frequency following major broadcasts, appearing less in wilderness and more in transitional urban spaces like drainage systems, reservoirs, and unfinished construction zones, places where human engineering intersected imperfectly with natural systems, reinforcing the idea that the phenomenon operated along fault lines both literal and conceptual. The most unsettling development occurred when a junior editor, reviewing raw footage late at night, noticed faint overlays in thermal recordings that resembled simplified human silhouettes, nested within the larger void. A detail initially dismissed as pareidolia until pattern analysis confirmed consistency across multiple sightings, raising the possibility that the phenomenon's interface borrowed aspects of human form not for deception, but for comprehension, a bridge between scales of perception. Confronting this possibility on air, the host acknowledged openly that certainty was slipping further away, even as clarity increased, because each layer of explanation revealed deeper complexity. And in a closing reflection, he posed the question that now haunted the investigation. If the phenomenon was not here to harm, not here to conquer, but here because it had always been here, embedded in the processes we barely understood, then what did it mean that we had only just begun to notice, and more importantly, that it had begun to notice us noticing? The episode ended without dramatic resolution, instead lingering on long shots of quiet water, industrial runoff channels, and night-lit marshes, accompanied by subdued narration reminding viewers that proof was not a moment but a process, and that sometimes the most profound discoveries were those that challenged not what we believed existed, but how we believed we related to it. Public perception shifted almost imperceptibly at first, not through headlines or official statements, but through tone, a subtle recalibration in how audiences spoke about the phenomenon, as comment sections that once mocked or sensationalized began to fill with measured curiosity, personal anecdotes, and uneasy questions that suggested something deeper than entertainment had been stirred. And this shift unsettled the production team more than overt panic ever could, because curiosity implied engagement, and engagement implied participation. The host noticed it during a live panel discussion when callers no longer asked whether the anomaly was real, but whether it was aware of them, a reframing that forced him to pause before answering, realizing that the investigation had crossed from external observation into collective introspection. Internal tensions mounted as network executives pushed for higher ratings-driven emphasis, urging clearer narrative hooks and dramatic language, while researchers argued that simplification risked distortion. And for the first time, the show's editorial meetings grew heated, revealing fractures between those who believed the program's responsibility ended with presenting evidence and those who felt an ethical obligation to contextualize impact. These debates intensified when data analysts reported a statistically significant correlation between broadcast schedules and anomaly activity, not as simple cause and effect, but as feedback. Spikes in manifestation frequency following episodes that emphasized interaction over skepticism, suggesting that attention itself might function as a variable within the system, a hypothesis both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The physicists liken it to observer effects in quantum mechanics, where measurement alters outcome, while the neuroscientists cautioned against anthropomorphizing complex processes. Yet neither could ignore the mounting evidence that the phenomenon responded differently when framed differently. Outside the studio, grassroots communities formed online, not cultic or conspiratorial in the traditional sense, but exploratory, exchanging environmental data, historical records, and personal experiences, often organizing informal observation efforts near wetlands and infrastructure zones, a development that alarmed authorities who feared uncontrolled exposure. Yet attempts to suppress discussion only fueled mistrust, reinforcing the sense that something meaningful was being withheld. The host found himself increasingly cast not just as an investigator but as a mediator, balancing transparency with caution, a role he had never sought. And the weight of it became apparent when a young viewer wrote, describing recurring dreams of standing at the edge of a flooded quarry, feeling watched yet protected, and asking whether this meant something was wrong with them, a question the host answered privately with care, emphasizing that human mind sought patterns especially under ambiguity. Yet privately he wondered whether reassurance was enough. Tensions peaked when a faction within a federal agency proposed a controlled public demonstration designed to demystify the phenomenon by forcing a limited, predictable manifestation. A plan leaked before approval and met with fierce opposition from scientists who warned that predictability was a human projection, not an inherent property of adaptive systems. Leaked correspondence revealed chilling confidence among proponents who viewed the phenomenon as a resource to be mapped and managed, language that echoed historical mistakes made with ecosystems, cultures, and technologies misunderstood until damaged beyond repair. Amid this backdrop, the production team received an unmarked data package containing decades-old footage from a hydroelectric facility where, during a catastrophic equipment failure, a massive thermal void had appeared upstream, coinciding with a sudden stabilization of water pressure that prevented dam collapse, an event officially attributed to mechanical redundancy, yet never satisfactorily explained. And reviewing this footage in light of current understanding reframed the narrative yet again, positioning the phenomenon not as an anomaly reacting to humans, but as a stabilizing process reacting to imbalance. This interpretation gained traction when environmental scientists noted that recent manifestations clustered around areas experiencing rapid ecological stress, from polluted canals to drought-stricken reservoirs, implying that increased visibility might reflect increased necessity rather than escalation. The host presented these findings carefully on air, aware that reframing the phenomenon as functional rather than threatening challenged deeply ingrained storytelling instincts. Yet the response was unexpectedly thoughtful, with viewers expressing relief at a narrative that did not default to fear, even as uncertainty remained. Behind the scenes, however, the strain took a toll. Crew members reporting heightened anxiety, disrupted sleep, and an inability to disengage mentally from the investigation, symptoms the neuroscientist attributed partly to sustained exposure to unresolved ambiguity, yet which also mirrored earlier reports from legacy research programs, raising uncomfortable parallels. A breaking point came when a junior field researcher, conducting routine sensor maintenance near a floodplain, experienced a close range manifestation lasting nearly 2 minutes, during which he reported an overwhelming sense of alignment, as though his awareness had been momentarily expanded beyond linear time, followed by intense emotional release rather than fear, an account corroborated by sensor data showing unprecedented signal coherence during the encounter. This incident divided the team, some viewing it as evidence of benign interaction, others as a warning that boundaries were eroding, and the hosts struggled publicly with this duality, acknowledging on air that certainty was not only elusive but perhaps incompatible with the phenomenon's nature. The most controversial moment of the episode came when the host addressed the audience directly, stating that while the show would continue its investigation, it would no longer pursue provocation or forced interaction, framing this decision not as retreat, but as respect for complexity, a stance that drew criticism from those demanding definitive proof, yet resonated with viewers who sensed that restraint itself conveyed understanding. As the episode closed, new footage played showing the anomaly briefly visible beneath the surface of a city reservoir at dawn, not looming or dramatic, but integrated, almost architectural in its stillness, and the host's final narration emphasized that humanity's greatest challenge might not be encountering the unknown, but learning to coexist with processes that did not center human perspective, reminding viewers that progress was not measured by domination or disclosure alone, but by the ability to recognize when observation must be tempered by humility. And as the screen faded to black, the lingering question was no longer whether proof existed, but whether humanity was prepared for a reality in which proof did not grant control, only responsibility. The crisis that had been building beneath layers of data, debate, and restraint finally surfaced, not through the phenomenon itself, but through human fracture, as the fragile alignment between science, media, and governance splintered under the weight of incompatible priorities. Because within weeks of the decision to halt provocation-based investigation, internal communications revealed that at least 2 parallel efforts were underway without coordination, one focused on long-term observation and environmental correlation, the other driven by political urgency and framed as risk mitigation, yet carrying all the hallmarks of escalation. The host learned of this divide through an off-record conversation with a longtime contact who admitted that the restraint publicly endorsed by the show had been interpreted by certain agencies not as wisdom, but as weakness, a vacuum to be filled by decisive action, and that preparations were already in motion for what was described euphemistically as an integrated response exercise. Language vague enough to obscure intent yet specific enough to raise alarm. As trust eroded, the production team faced its own reckoning when a senior editor resigned abruptly, citing ethical discomfort with continuing to document a process that appeared to be accelerating beyond journalistic boundaries, a departure that shook the group and forced a reckoning about complicity, because documenting without intervention now felt indistinguishable from endorsement. Meanwhile, public discourse fractured along familiar lines, with some voices demanding transparency and coexistence, others calling for containment or eradication based on worst-case projections, and a growing number expressing quiet unease, not rooted in fear of the unknown, but in recognition of human behavioral patterns repeating themselves with unsettling fidelity. The phenomenon, for its part, appeared to respond not to rhetoric but to consequence, as manifestations clustered around areas of heightened institutional activity, particularly sites associated with sensor deployment, energy testing, and subterranean mapping, suggesting that it was not attracted to attention but to alteration, a distinction the physicist emphasized repeatedly as reports showed reduced activity near passive observation zones and intensified coherence near experimental ones. This distinction became tragically relevant when the integrated response exercise proceeded in a modified form, utilizing a network of synchronized low-frequency emitters deployed across a mineral-dense floodplain under the justification of infrastructure resilience testing, a move approved hastily amid bureaucratic ambiguity and plausible deniability. And although the production team was officially excluded, Data leakage made it clear that the operation aimed to force systemic feedback at scale, an act many experts privately equated to shouting into an echo chamber without knowing what answered. The response was immediate but not explosive, unfolding instead as a cascade of subtle failures, power grids experiencing oscillations too rhythmic to be random, wildlife migrating erratically, atmospheric pressure gradients shifting enough to ground flights, and most disturbingly, widespread reports of disorientation among nearby populations, characterized by temporal confusion and intrusive spatial imagery, symptoms eerily consistent with earlier, smaller-scale incidents. The host, breaking from typical neutrality, addressed the unfolding situation with visible strain, emphasizing that the absence of violence did not imply absence of harm, and that systems capable of stabilization could just as easily destabilize if forced beyond tolerance, a statement that drew criticism from officials accusing the program of alarmism, even as internal memos acknowledged unanticipated consequences. Amid the chaos, a breakthrough emerged not from escalation, but from restraint, when a remote wetland monitoring station left intentionally unaltered recorded an extended manifestation unlike any before, not looming or distorted, but remarkably stable, its thermal profile resolving into layered structures that suggested complexity without aggression, and accompanying data indicated a localized reduction in environmental stress markers, including water toxicity and temperature variance, a quiet counterpoint to the disruptions elsewhere. Analyzing this contrast, the team recognized a pattern too consistent to ignore, that the phenomenon appeared to function optimally when allowed to operate without interference, reinforcing the hypothesis that it was not an intruder but an emergent regulatory process responding to imbalance, and that human attempts to force interaction disrupted that regulation. This interpretation gained unexpected support from an unlikely source when a former defense contractor, now terminally ill and seeking absolution, came forward with documentation of a long-abandoned project exploring the use of geological formations as adaptive signal substrates, a project terminated after researchers realized they were not broadcasting into emptiness, but into something that responded by altering environmental parameters, a discovery deemed too unpredictable to weaponize and too profound to disclose. As these revelations surfaced, the host faced the most difficult decision of his career, whether to continue framing the investigation within the safe bounds of inquiry or to confront viewers with the uncomfortable reality that humanity's greatest threat might be its inability to recognize systems not designed for domination, and choosing the latter. He delivered a rare, unscripted monologue acknowledging that the line between observer and participant had been crossed not by the phenomenon, but by human insistence on control. The consequences of the integrated response exercise reached a tipping point when a reservoir adjacent to one of the emitter sites experienced a sudden, precise release of pressure through an unmonitored spillway, preventing structural failure yet flooding downstream wetlands in a pattern that mirrored natural seasonal cycles rather than catastrophic breach, an outcome that baffled engineers yet aligned eerily with earlier accounts of quiet mitigation, forcing officials to concede, at least internally, that the phenomenon's actions could not be reduced to threat models. Within the production team, unity returned through shared resolve, a consensus that the story could no longer be told as an investigation into a thing, but as an examination of a relationship, one shaped by humility or hubris depending on choice. And as the episode concluded, footage intercut contrasting scenes of human escalation and passive observation, showing clearly where disruption followed force and equilibrium followed restraint. The host closed not with a warning but with an admission that certainty was not only unattainable but potentially dangerous, and that the most responsible path forward might be to listen rather than demand answers, a sentiment underscored by the final image of the stable wetland manifestation fading gently as dawn broke, leaving behind not fear or awe, but the unsettling calm of a system that had adjusted once again despite humanity's best efforts to define it, reminding viewers that coexistence was not a passive state, but an active discipline, one requiring patience, accountability, and the courage to accept that not every proof was meant to be extracted, and not every mystery existed to be solved on human terms. The aftermath did not arrive as a single reckoning, but as a slow, grinding reorientation, a collective adjustment to the realization that something fundamental had shifted and would not return to its previous state. Because in the months following the failed integrated response exercise, global policy quietly pivoted away from confrontation and toward what officials cautiously termed non-intrusive environmental stewardship, a phrase deliberately vague yet laden with implication, signaling an unspoken acknowledgement that the phenomenon's apparent withdrawal from several high-activity zones was not a victory, but a warning. Data confirmed what many feared but few were willing to articulate publicly, that manifestations had become less frequent in areas of aggressive monitoring and more stable, though subtler, in regions where industrial activity slowed or adaptive conservation measures were implemented, reinforcing the unsettling conclusion that visibility had been a function of stress rather than proximity, and that humanity's insistence on proof had inadvertently trained the phenomenon to retreat rather than engage. The host framed this development not as disappearance, but as attenuation, comparing it to a vital system going dormant when overstimulated, a metaphor that resonated deeply when environmental scientists reported unexpected stabilization in select wetlands where manifestations had once been strongest, followed by gradual normalization as the anomaly faded from detectable range, leaving behind ecosystems subtly altered yet more resilient, as though something had intervened long enough to recalibrate before stepping back. This raised a question no one wanted to ask too loudly, whether the phenomenon's presence had been a response to crisis rather than a constant, and whether humanity's failure to listen had accelerated its withdrawal before understanding could mature. Public sentiment evolved alongside policy, drifting away from spectacle and toward uneasy reflection, as online communities that once hunted sightings now shared long-term environmental data and oral histories, uncovering patterns of unexplained stabilization during past disasters, floods that spared certain regions, collapses that did not propagate as expected, and moments where catastrophes seemed to hesitate, all coinciding with conditions now associated with the phenomenon, suggesting a quiet legacy woven through human history unnoticed, because it did not announce itself. Within the production team, the tone of the investigation changed irreversibly as episodes shifted from pursuit to documentation, from uncovering anomalies to contextualizing absence, a transition that drew criticism from those craving resolution, but earned respect from viewers who sensed that something irretrievable had been lost. The host himself grappled openly with doubt, questioning whether the show's early insistence on evidence had contributed to the narrowing of possibilities, a rare moment of accountability that reframed journalism not as neutral transmission, but as an active force shaping interaction. And as he revisited early footage of the swamp manifestation, now seen through the lens of what followed, its stillness read less as menace and more as patience, a patience arguably exhausted by human escalation. A defining moment arrived when a multinational environmental summit quietly incorporated language reflecting principles derived from the investigation, emphasizing systems-based thinking, nonlinear causality, and the recognition of adaptive processes beyond human governance. Language carefully crafted to avoid explicit reference, yet unmistakably influenced by the phenomenon's narrative. A subtle institutional shift acknowledging that control was not the only measure of security. Simultaneously, internal disclosures reveal that several legacy monitoring programs have been permanently decommissioned, their data sealed not out of secrecy, but obsolescence, because without active manifestation the metrics they relied upon lost coherence, leaving behind a trove of partial understanding and unanswered questions. The host addressed this on air with restrained candor, stating that the absence of new evidence was itself evidence of consequence, that the phenomenon's retreat mirrored countless historical moments where misunderstanding led to withdrawal, extinction, or silence, patterns humanity recognized only in hindsight, and he challenged viewers to consider whether closure was a human luxury incompatible with complex realities. As the series progressed, reports of direct encounters dwindled to near zero, replaced instead by indirect effects, anomalous recoveries, delayed failures that never occurred, and environmental adjustments too precise to be random, yet too diffuse to attribute, reinforcing the sense that whatever intelligence had once surfaced had recalibrated its engagement threshold. The final emotional weight of this realization crystallized during an interview with an elderly floodplain resident who described witnessing a towering figure decades earlier and feeling no fear, only reassurance, and who now expressed quiet sadness that no one would ever see it again, not as loss of mystery, but as loss of a guardian misunderstood, a sentiment the host did not validate explicitly yet did not dismiss. In his closing reflection for the episode, the host articulated the central tension that now defined the investigation, that humanity had demanded proof as a prerequisite for respect, rather than offering respect as a pathway to understanding, and that the phenomenon's withdrawal posed a question more difficult than confirmation ever could: whether success should be measured by dominance over the unknown or by the preservation of relationships not fully comprehended. The episode ended not with footage of absence, but with long, unbroken shots of stabilized wetlands, quiet reservoirs, and infrastructure standing intact after storms that models had predicted would overwhelm them, accompanied by subdued narration acknowledging that proof was sometimes only visible in what did not happen, and that the most profound consequences of contact were often recorded not in spectacle, but in restraint. As the screen faded to black, the implication lingered uncomfortably that humanity might never know whether the phenomenon would return, not because it could not, but because it chose not to, and that choice, shaped by human behavior, would stand as the most enduring evidence of all, a silent verdict rendered not by judgment or malice, but by withdrawal, leaving behind a world slightly steadier, and a species left to wonder whether it had passed a test it never realized it was taking. With the phenomenon no longer presenting itself in ways easily captured by cameras or sensors, the investigation entered a retrospective phase, one that proved unexpectedly unsettling because absence forced attention backward, toward fragments of history long ignored or misfiled. And as researchers combed through archives unburdened by the urgency of real-time events, patterns emerged that suggested the recent manifestations were not anomalies at all, but the latest expressions of an ancient, adaptive presence threaded through human development. The host became increasingly absorbed in these historical echoes, particularly accounts from pre-industrial societies describing watchful figures associated with wetlands, fault lines, and mineral springs, entities framed not as gods or monsters, but as wardens, keepers of balance whose appearance signaled transition rather than threat. And while modern skepticism dismissed such stories as metaphor or superstition, the specificity of environmental correlation mirrored contemporary data too closely to ignore. One particularly striking parallel emerged from colonial-era flood records noting inexplicable pauses in rising waters, delays lasting hours that allowed evacuations to complete despite rainfall volumes that should have overwhelmed levees, events recorded without explanation and attributed vaguely to fortune, yet now resonate with the stabilizing behaviors documented in recent decades. This retrospective lens reframed the Martian sea classification as well, suggesting that what engineers had encountered during early space exploration was not an extraterrestrial signal, but an echo, a resonance triggered when human technology inadvertently intersected with a system already operating at planetary scale. A system indifferent to origin but responsive to disruption. The physicists proposed that the phenomenon functioned less like an entity moving through space and more like a distributed intelligence embedded within certain physical conditions, surfacing where pressure gradients, mineral conductivity, and ecological stress aligned, and retreating when equilibrium returned, a hypothesis that aligned uncomfortably well with the observed withdrawal following aggressive interference. As these ideas took shape, the production team faced a paradox that deeper understanding seemed to reduce the likelihood of renewed manifestation, as if clarity itself altered the conditions necessary for interface, forcing them to confront whether continued excavation of meaning risked further attenuation. Meanwhile, subtle indicators suggested the phenomenon had not vanished entirely, but had shifted expression, as long-term environmental monitoring revealed micro-adjustments too precise to be random. Floodwaters diverting by margins of inches, soil stabilization occurring just enough to prevent landslides, infrastructure enduring stresses at thresholds models could not fully explain, events dismissed individually, but collectively forming a quiet signature of influence. These findings prompted renewed debate about visibility versus impact, whether humanity's fixation on spectacle had blinded it to more profound forms of interaction, and the host articulated this tension on air by acknowledging that the desire to see often overshadowed the capacity to perceive, a distinction that resonated deeply with viewers who felt the story's center of gravity had moved inward. Personal accounts continued to arrive, fewer in number but richer in introspection. Individuals describing moments of sudden calm during environmental crises, an inexplicable certainty that disaster would not unfold as feared. Experiences that defied verification, yet mirrored each other in emotional tone rather than detail, suggesting a shared phenomenological imprint rather than coordinated fabrication. These narratives force the team to grapple with the limits of empirical framing, not abandoning rigor but recognizing that certain forms of influence might register primarily through outcome rather than observation, a concept uncomfortable for disciplines trained to privilege visibility. Tension resurfaced when a leaked proposal surfaced advocating renewed controlled testing under the guise of climate resilience research, a move justified as necessary in light of increasing environmental instability, yet widely criticized by those who saw it as repetition of past mistakes. And the host addressed this openly, reminding viewers that every previous escalation had resulted in withdrawal rather than cooperation, a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. As debates intensified, the production team reached a quiet consensus that the story had evolved beyond investigation into reflection, less about uncovering what the phenomenon was and more about understanding how humanity's framework shaped its responses. And in a rare departure from standard format, the host devoted an episode segment to acknowledging uncertainty not as failure but as boundary, an admission that some systems might only remain accessible when approached with humility rather than demand. The emotional weight of this realization culminated in the rediscovery of early swamp footage, now reanalyzed not for form but for context, revealing that the most coherent manifestations occurred during moments of environmental transition rather than crisis, suggesting that the phenomenon surfaced not to rescue or punish, but to guide systems through thresholds, a role rendered obsolete when human intervention became too forceful. The episode closed on a contemplative note, lingering on landscapes unchanged yet subtly studied, accompanied by narration proposing that disappearance did not equate to absence, but to integration, that the phenomenon may have receded not into distance but into background, becoming once again what it had always been before attention made it visible, a silent regulator operating below the threshold of notice. The final thought offered was not reassurance but responsibility, that if the phenomenon had learned from humanity's behavior and adjusted accordingly, then humanity's future interactions with the unknown would be shaped less by what it encountered and more by how it chose to listen. A lesson as unsettling as any sighting, because it suggested that proof, once demanded, might now be something humanity had to earn rather than extract. The first indication that the phenomenon had not ended its engagement, but merely transformed it came not from wetlands or deserts, but from data so ordinary it initially escaped notice, buried within routine environmental reports showing marginal yet statistically improbable deviations, river levels stabilizing just below flood thresholds across unrelated regions, seismic micro-events dissipating without propagation, infrastructure failures resolving themselves through cascading redundancies. Too well-timed to be coincidence, and it was only when analysts overlaid these datasets that a pattern emerged, one lacking dramatic focal points yet spanning continents, suggesting coordination without concentration. The host described this shift as unsettling precisely because it defied the narrative structures humans relied upon, offering no singular image to scrutinize, no silhouette to fear or admire, only outcomes, subtle corrections executed with surgical precision, as though the phenomenon had learned that visibility invited interference and invisibility ensured efficacy. This reframing challenged even the most sympathetic observers, because absence of spectacle left little to debate, no footage to analyze, only a growing sense that the world was behaving slightly better than expected under stress. A realization both comforting and deeply disorienting. Scientists debated whether these effects could be attributed to improved modeling or chance clustering, yet repeated, blind tests failed to account for the coherence observed, especially when deviations aligned temporally with periods of reduced human intervention, reinforcing the hypothesis that restraint itself had become a signal. Internal documents revealed that certain agencies had noticed the same trend and quietly adjusted operational doctrines, delaying large-scale environmental manipulations in favor of adaptive monitoring, a tacit admission that forcing outcomes had become counterproductive. Within the production team, this evolution reignited ethical debate, because documenting subtle stabilization risked being dismissed as conjecture, yet ignoring it felt dishonest, forcing the host to articulate a narrative centered not on discovery, but on discernment, a tonal shift that tested audience patience but deepened trust among those attuned to nuance. Public reaction followed a similar divide, some viewers expressing frustration at the lack of definitive revelation, others expressing a quiet relief that the story no longer trafficked in fear, and a growing minority articulating a sense that humanity was being observed not through eyes but through consequence, evaluated by how systems were treated rather than how mysteries were chased. The most provocative development occurred when a remote climate observatory detected a recurrence of the Martian sea harmonic structure, not as a distinct signal but as a modulation embedded within natural background noise, so faint it required weeks of cumulative data to isolate, yet unmistakably structured, suggesting that the phenomenon had re-established a channel of interaction too subtle to trigger defensive reflexes, a whisper rather than a call. The physicists liken it to a handshake offered without extending a hand, a test of attentiveness rather than dominance, and this interpretation gained traction when similar modulations were identified retrospectively in historical datasets, coinciding with periods of large-scale environmental recovery following restraint or conservation. The host addressed these findings with deliberate caution, emphasizing that interpretation remains speculative, yet acknowledging that the reappearance of structured coherence after withdrawal challenged assumptions about finality, implying that the phenomenon's retreat had been conditional rather than absolute. Tension escalated when a leaked policy draft proposed renewed engagement under strict non-provocative guidelines, a move framed as partnership rather than control. Yet critics warned that even benevolent framing risked reintroducing anthropocentric bias, the assumption that interaction required initiation. Within the team, memories of earlier escalation tempered enthusiasm, and the host articulated a principle that would define the investigation's next phase, that the goal was no longer to invite response, but to observe whether response occurred naturally under sustained restraint, a test not of the phenomenon's willingness to engage, but of humanity's capacity to wait. As this philosophy took hold, a singular anomaly emerged that defied easy categorization, a brief, localized stabilization event during a severe storm system, where predictive models forecasted catastrophic failure yet conditions eased just enough to avert disaster, followed by a faint, transient coherent spike across multiple monitoring stations, a moment too fleeting to celebrate yet too precise to ignore. The host framed this not as proof of return but as indication of presence, a reminder that influence need not announce itself to be real, and that the phenomenon's most profound statement might be its refusal to perform. The emotional weight of this realization culminated in an on-air reflection, where the host admitted that the investigation had inverted its original premise, that rather than asking whether something was out there, the more pressing question had become whether humanity could coexist with intelligences that communicated through balance rather than spectacle, and whether proof, once demanded as evidence of conquest, could be redefined as evidence of trust. As the episode closed, visuals lingered on systems holding just long enough to prevent collapse, dams not breached, grids not failed, storms weakening at critical thresholds, accompanied by narration suggesting that the phenomenon's return, if it could be called that, was not a reappearance but a recalibration, a quiet resumption of function, contingent on human behavior. The final implication hung unresolved yet unavoidable, that humanity stood at the edge of a choice not marked by confrontation but by patience, and that the phenomenon, whatever its origin, had made its terms clear without speaking, offering no guarantees, only a conditional presence that would persist only as long as restraint, humility, and attention replaced the old reflex to force understanding, leaving viewers not with fear or certainty, but with a unsettling awareness that the most consequential dialogue between humanity and the unknown might now be unfolding in silence. The global decision did not arrive through dramatic announcements or emergency broadcasts, but through a slow convergence of policies, omissions, and carefully worded agreements that collectively signaled a turning point. Because after months of observing subtle stabilizations and conditional coherence, international bodies quietly aligned around a principle that would have been unthinkable years earlier, the acceptance that not all systems could be optimized through intervention, and that some forms of intelligence, if that term even applied, required distance rather than engagement to function effectively. This principle manifested first as restraint, large-scale geoengineering projects delayed indefinitely, experimental signal arrays dismantled under the guise of budget realignment, and data-sharing frameworks rewritten to prioritize long-term environmental baselines over anomaly detection, moves framed publicly as climate responsibility, yet informed privately by the growing consensus that forcing interaction had proven consistently counterproductive. The host described this shift as a moral inflection point rather than a scientific one, noting that humanity had not reached understanding through mastery, but through exhaustion, a reluctant humility born of repeated failure, and this framing resonated uncomfortably with viewers who recognized echoes of past reckonings with systems too complex to dominate. Resistance remained, of course, concentrated among factions, unwilling to relinquish the promise of control, arguing that withdrawal equated to surrender, that knowledge withheld was opportunity lost, and that humanity could not afford passivity in an unstable world. Yet these arguments weakened as evidence mounted that restraint correlated with resilience, that systems left alone adjusted in ways models could not predict, but outcomes consistently favored. The most intense debate centered on a proposed global accord informally dubbed the Threshold Doctrine, a set of non-binding yet symbolically potent commitments emphasizing non-provocation, environmental patience, and the recognition of adaptive processes beyond human governance. Language deliberately abstract to avoid explicit reference, yet unmistakably shaped by the investigation's findings. Critics dismiss the doctrine as mysticism masquerading as policy, while supporters argued it represented the first mature response to uncertainty, a willingness to coexist without comprehension. The host approached this debate with visible ambivalence, acknowledging the discomfort inherent in choosing not to know, yet challenging the assumption that ignorance and restraint were synonymous, suggesting instead that choosing not to intervene was itself an informed act shaped by hard-earned pattern recognition. As the doctrine gained traction, an unexpected development reframed the stakes entirely when long-term monitoring revealed a global synchronization of microstabilization events, small yet coherent adjustments occurring across unrelated systems within narrow temporal windows, suggesting not a return of overt manifestation but a deepening integration, as though the phenomenon had recalibrated its engagement strategy in response to humanity's behavioral shift. The physicists described this as a phase transition, a move from discrete interface to distributed influence, a state less visible but more resilient, and crucially, less susceptible to disruption, implying that the phenomenon's future presence depended not on recognition but on conditions. This interpretation unsettled even those who advocated restraint, because it suggested that the opportunity for direct understanding might already have passed, that humanity's insistence on proof had delayed engagement until the phenomenon no longer required it. The host addressed this possibility with rare candor, admitting that the investigation might have documented the closing of a window rather than its opening, a realization that cast earlier triumphs in a more somber light. Public reaction reflected this complexity, with some expressing relief that catastrophe had been averted, others mourning the loss of mystery as a form of connection, and a quieter group articulating something closer to guilt, a sense that humanity had been evaluated and found wanting not through punishment, but through withdrawal. This emotional undercurrent surfaced most clearly in personal accounts describing a lingering absence, not of sightings but of reassurance, a feeling that the quiet stabilizations lack the comfort once provided by visible guardianship, forcing individuals to confront responsibility without external validation. Amid this introspection, a final controversy erupted when a coalition of states proposed a controlled rollback of restraint measures to test whether overt manifestation could be coaxed back under improved ethical frameworks, a proposal that ignited fierce opposition from scientists and ethicists who warned that the phenomenon's silence might represent a boundary rather than an invitation, and that crossing it again risked permanent disengagement. The host, faced with the prospect of history repeating itself, used his platform to articulate the investigation's ultimate lesson, that the desire to confirm existence often masked a deeper need for reassurance, and that relinquishing that need did not diminish humanity, but challenged it to mature beyond reflexive domination. The decision that followed was anticlimactic yet profound. The rollback proposal tabled indefinitely, restraint reaffirmed not as policy, but as practice, and in that moment, without fanfare, humanity chose to prioritize coexistence over certainty. The consequences of this choice were subtle yet far-reaching. As months passed without dramatic anomaly, yet with fewer catastrophic failures than models predicted, a pattern too consistent to dismiss, yet too quiet to celebrate, reinforcing the investigation's central paradox, that success might manifest only as absence. The host concluded this phase of the story with a reflection that bordered on elegy, acknowledging that while the phenomenon's nature remained unresolved, its influence had reshaped human behavior in ways no discovery ever had, forcing a reconsideration of progress, responsibility, and the limits of inquiry. As the episode closed, visuals lingered on ordinary systems functioning under extraordinary strain and holding, not because of intervention, but because of alignment, accompanied by narration that posed the question viewers now carried forward: whether humanity's greatest achievement in this encounter was not the knowledge gained, but the restraint learned, and whether the phenomenon, whatever its origin or intent, would remain woven into the fabric of the world only as long as that restraint endured, leaving open the possibility that disappearance was not failure, but the final measure of success, a proof, rendered not through revelation, but through balance maintained in silence. The sign did not announce itself through spectacle, nor did it resemble the dramatic incursions humanity had once anticipated, because when it finally appeared it did so at the margins of attention, embedded within ordinary data streams and dismissed at first as statistical noise, a deviation so minor that it escaped all but the most patient observers, yet its persistence transformed insignificance into inevitability. The anomaly manifested as a recurring temporal asymmetry detected simultaneously across multiple independent monitoring systems, each calibrated to different baselines and objectives, yet all registering the same subtle lag, a delay measured not in seconds, but in microintervals that repeated with unnatural regularity, forming a pattern too consistent to attribute to instrumentation error. The host introduced this development cautiously, aware that the investigation's audience had been conditioned to expect revelation in the form of images or encounters, yet emphasizing that this sign's power lay precisely in its refusal to be seen, existing instead as a quiet insistence within the architecture of measurement itself. Analysts quickly realized that the asymmetry did not originate from any external intrusion, but appeared to arise internally, as though the systems were responding to an influence that altered their synchronization without altering their function, a distinction that baffled traditional models of causality. The mathematician described it as a phase echo, a residue of alignment persisting after active engagement had ceased, suggesting that while overt interaction had withdrawn, structural influence remained embedded within the fabric of process. This interpretation unsettled those who had embraced restraint as closure, because it implied that disengagement had not erased connection, but transformed it into something less legible, more intimate, and therefore more difficult to confront. Public discourse reignited almost immediately, though in a different register than before, no longer fueled by fear of invasion or hope of revelation, but by an unease rooted in ambiguity, the sense that humanity was no longer being watched, yet not entirely alone either. The host framed this moment as the investigation's most delicate threshold, because to acknowledge the sign risked reactivating the very impulses that restraint had tempered, while to ignore it risked self-deception, a denial of evidence because it did not conform to expectation. Debates fractured along philosophical rather than political lines, with some arguing that the sign represented a farewell, a final imprint left behind as the phenomenon retreated permanently, while others contended it marked a probationary state, a conditional presence contingent upon continued restraint. The physicist advanced a more unsettling hypothesis, proposing that the sign was neither message nor residue, but a mirror, a reflection of humanity's own systemic coherence achieved through enforced humility, suggesting that what observers perceived as external influence might instead be an emergent property of global alignment catalyzed, but no longer sustained by the phenomenon. This idea resonated uncomfortably, because it reframed the encounter not as a relationship between species or intelligences, but as a developmental catalyst that had already fulfilled its function, leaving humanity to grapple with the consequences alone. The host acknowledged the emotional weight of this possibility, noting that many viewers expressed a sense of abandonment mingled with relief, a contradictory response reflecting humanity's long dependence on external validation, whether divine, technological, or otherwise. As research intensified, another layer of complexity emerged when archival analysis revealed faint traces of the same temporal asymmetry buried deep within historical datasets predating the investigation by decades. Anomalies previously dismissed due to insufficient resolution, but now reinterpreted as early manifestations, suggesting that the phenomenon's influence may have preceded conscious recognition, operating quietly until humanity developed the tools and circumstances to notice. This realization destabilized the narrative of first contact entirely, implying that the encounter was not a discrete event, but a prolonged process unfolding across generations, one that humanity had only recently become capable of contextualizing. The host reflected on this, with a rare moment of introspection, questioning whether the investigation had truly uncovered something new, or merely named a presence that had always existed at the edges of comprehension. This introspection extended to the ethics of documentation itself, as producers debated whether continuing the series risked transforming observation into interference once again, a meta-concern that blurred the line between subject and method. Ultimately, the decision to proceed rested on a commitment to transparency paired with restraint, to present findings without speculation, trusting viewers to engage without demanding resolution. This approach was tested when a private research consortium leaked an analysis claiming the asymmetry could be amplified under controlled conditions to produce measurable predictive advantages, reigniting fears that curiosity would once again override caution. The host addressed the leak directly, neither endorsing nor dismissing it, but contextualizing it within the investigation's broader lesson that capability did not equate to obligation, and that the measure of progress lay not in what could be extracted, but in what could be preserved. Public reaction to this stance was polarized, with some accusing the investigation of romanticizing ignorance, while others praised its refusal to commodify uncertainty. Amid this tension, an unexpected consensus emerged within a younger demographic, many of whom viewed the sign not as a problem to be solved but as a boundary to be respected, interpreting restraint not as loss but as inheritance, a cultural shift towards stewardship over conquest. This generational perspective reframed the narrative once more, positioning the phenomenon less as an external mystery and more as a catalyst for internal evolution, a force that compelled humanity to redefine intelligence, success, and coexistence. The host highlighted this shift with a montage of ordinary lives adapting to systemic changes once deemed impossible, communities prioritizing resilience over growth, institutions embracing long-term stability over short-term gain, all developments statistically modest, yet collectively transformative. As the episode approached its conclusion, the sign persisted, unchanged yet undeniable, neither escalating nor fading, occupying a liminal space that defied narrative closure. The host resisted the temptation to assign meaning, instead articulating the investigation's most challenging insight, that not all questions culminate in answers, and that some truths function not as revelations, but as constraints shaping behavior through absence rather than presence. He posed a final reflection to the audience, suggesting that the phenomenon's greatest intervention may have been teaching humanity to tolerate uncertainty without seeking domination, to recognize that coexistence did not require comprehension, only respect. As visuals faded into the quiet rhythms of systems, maintaining equilibrium, the narration underscored the investigation's evolving thesis that proof was not always something found, but something lived, expressed through choices repeated daily, restraint reaffirmed not once but continuously. The sign remained unresolved, not as failure but as invitation, a reminder that the boundary between observer and observed was never fixed, and that humanity's response would ultimately define the encounter more than the phenomenon itself. The episode closed without resolution, yet not without consequence, leaving viewers with the unsettling comfort that while the universe had not revealed its intentions, it had offered humanity a chance to mature beyond its need for certainty, and that whether this chance endured depended less on external forces than on humanity's willingness to honor the silence it had finally learned to hear. The end did not arrive as an ending, because endings imply closure, and what humanity reached instead was a condition, a sustained state of awareness shaped less by answers than by habits formed in the long shadow of uncertainty. And it was within this quiet persistence that the final chapter of the investigation unfolded, not through discovery, but through normalization, the moment when the extraordinary dissolved into the background of daily existence and ceased to demand attention in order to exert influence. The sign remained present, unchanged in magnitude or rhythm, a constant asymmetry embedded within systems so thoroughly that its absence would have been more alarming than its continuation, and over time its persistence transformed from curiosity into assumption, a baseline against which other variables were measured without comment. The host acknowledged this shift with a tone that balanced melancholy and resolve, noting that the investigation had not concluded because the mystery was solved, but because the framework through which it had been pursued was no longer appropriate, as relentless inquiry had given way to stewardship, and observation had yielded to responsibility. This reframing challenged traditional narratives of exploration, which valorized conquest and comprehension, replacing them with a quieter ethic grounded in maintenance, continuity, and restraint, values historically undervalued precisely because they resisted spectacle. The host traced this ethical evolution through subtle changes across institutions once defined by extraction and acceleration, now recalibrated toward sustainability and resilience, a transformation neither universal nor uniform but statistically undeniable, suggesting that the encounter's most profound legacy lay not in altered physics or expanded cosmology, but in recalibrated priorities. Critics continued to argue that this shift represented capitulation, a retreat from humanity's defining impulse to understand. Yet their voices carried less urgency as catastrophic projections repeatedly failed to materialize, replaced instead by incremental stability that defied both optimism and cynicism. The investigation documented these outcomes with deliberate restraint, resisting triumphalism, emphasizing instead that stability was not victory but vigilance, a condition requiring continuous commitment rather than celebration. The sign's neutrality reinforced this lesson, offering neither reward nor punishment, existing without response to praise or provocation, an unyielding constant that mirrored humanity's own emerging discipline. As the series approached its final broadcast, internal debates surfaced regarding the ethics of conclusion itself. Whether ending the investigation risked signaling abandonment or denial, yet consensus emerged that continuation for its own sake risked reactivating the very dynamics that had necessitated restraint, turning attention into intrusion once more. The host articulated this tension with rare vulnerability, admitting that the drive to keep asking questions often masked discomfort with stillness, and that learning to stop was as demanding as learning to pursue. This admission resonated deeply with audiences who had followed the investigation not merely as observers, but as participants in a collective recalibration of curiosity. Letters and messages poured in from viewers describing how the series had altered their perception of uncertainty, some recounting personal transformations sparked by the realization that not knowing did not equate to failure, others expressing grief for the loss of narrative clarity, yet gratitude for the space it created. These testimonies underscore the investigation's unexpected cultural impact, extending beyond science into philosophy, education, and even interpersonal relationships, where tolerance for ambiguity began to replace the compulsion for resolution. The host reflected on these responses with humility, emphasizing that the investigation had never intended to prescribe meaning, only to document a process whose implications exceeded its scope. As part of the final episode, the series returned to its origins, revisiting early footage now reframed by years of context. Moments once charged with anticipation, now imbued with a quiet irony, as viewers recognized how much of the drama had been projected rather than revealed. This retrospective was not presented as correction or critique, but as evolution, illustrating how perception matured alongside understanding, and how fear gradually gave way to discernment. The host emphasized that this maturation did not diminish humanity's capacity for wonder, but refined it, shifting off from spectacle to balance, from disruption to endurance. The final analysis centered on a deceptively simple question: whether the phenomenon required recognition to exist meaningfully, or whether meaning itself was a human construct imposed upon processes. Indifferent to interpretation, the investigation offered no definitive answer, instead proposing that meaning emerged not from the phenomenon's intent, but from humanity's response, a conclusion that positioned agency firmly within human choice rather than external influence. This perspective reframed the sign one last time, not as message, threat, or guide, but as context, an environmental constant shaping behavior through constraint rather than instruction. The host likened this to gravity, an unseen force whose presence was inferred through effect rather than declaration, shaping movement without demanding attention. This analogy resonated because it dissolved the remaining tension between mystery and normalcy, allowing the sign to exist without narrative burden. As the final minutes unfolded, the investigation shifted focus away from data and theory toward lived experience, highlighting individuals and communities navigating systems, now defined by patience and reciprocity. Scenes intentionally ordinary, chosen to emphasize continuity over climax. These moments underscore the investigation's closing assertion: that humanity's response to the encounter would be measured not by declarations or discoveries, but by habits sustained over time, choices repeated quietly without external validation. The host addressed the audience directly one final time, acknowledging that the absence of resolution might feel unsatisfying, yet challenging the assumption that satisfaction was the appropriate metric for truth, suggesting instead that endurance, balance, and humility offered a more durable foundation for coexistence. He emphasized that the investigation's conclusion did not mark an end to curiosity, but a refinement of it, a commitment to ask questions without demanding control, to observe without insisting on dominance. The final visual sequence lingered on systems functioning within narrow margins, ecosystems stabilizing through incremental adjustments, human infrastructure adapting to constraints once resisted, all underscored by narration that framed these outcomes not as concessions, but as achievements earned through restraint. The sign remained present throughout, neither foreground nor hidden, a quiet constant within the frame, its neutrality reinforcing the investigation's final thesis, that coexistence did not require affirmation, only consistency. As the episode closed, the host offered a final reflection that encapsulated the journey's arc, that the proof humanity sought had not arrived as revelation, but as transformation, not something observed externally, but something enacted collectively through choice. He concluded that the phenomenon's greatest legacy might be this shift itself, a recalibration of humanity's relationship with uncertainty, power, and responsibility, leaving open the possibility that silence was not absence, but invitation, an ongoing test measured not in data points, but in restraint maintained. The screen faded without music or dramatic cue, allowing the quiet to persist unbroken, an intentional gesture reinforcing the investigation's closing truth, that sometimes the most honest ending is not a conclusion, but a continuation lived beyond the frame, where meaning is sustained not by answers given, but by balance preserved, and where the final proof is not found, but practiced, every day, without witness, in the enduring choice to coexist rather than conquer.